The whole of history, reality, life, the future, the past, and as we sang, it pivots on Jesus. Jesus is central to the history and the existence of humanity, and he infiltrates and informs every aspect of our existence, whether you acknowledge that or not, past, present and future. And when we start considering Jesus and his uniqueness and his identity, I think it's important to establish the reasons why we consider Jesus unique. We're here today because of Jesus. So why would we follow Jesus? I mean, what is different about Jesus? And why do we have confidence in following Jesus? And not only that, why do we have confidence going out and talking to other people about Jesus? Well, the early church approached the uniqueness of Jesus, and sometimes you could describe that as the deity of Jesus, that Jesus was more than human, that he was God, because that's what we declare and that's what we believe, the deity of Jesus, in two specific ways. So they established the uniqueness of Jesus in two specific ways. Firstly, they appealed to the resurrection of Jesus. Now, they believed, the early church, that there was absolute proof that Jesus rose from the dead, and now we believe that now. And I think there's ample evidence to suggest that. So the appeal of the early church to establishing that Jesus was unique and was God as well as human was his resurrection. But the second thing they referred to in the Old Testament were the Old Testament prophecies, which Jesus fulfilled in his earthly ministry, the predictions in the Old Testament about Jesus. And I want to talk a fair bit about that today. The Old Testament was written over a 1,000-year period, and it was written way before Jesus came to this earth, over 1,000 years. And all these prophecies that are mentioned about Jesus, about the coming Messiah, about the Christ, in the Old Testament were fulfilled in Jesus. Now, I can make a sweeping statement like that, but I need to now establish that that's the case. But Jesus himself claimed this. And so I think we've got to start with what Jesus claimed about himself. Jesus said in Matthew 5:17, "Do not think that I came to destroy the law or prophets. I did not come to destroy them, but to fulfill them." So Jesus himself claimed that he'd come to fulfill these prophecies about the coming Messiah, about him. And he made the point of showing his disciples, constantly showing his disciples, how the Old Testament related to him and referred to him. He said in Luke 24:27, and beginning, what it says in Luke 24:27, and beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So Jesus claimed that these prophecies, these predictions about the coming Messiah, the Christ, the one who would save the world, referred to him. Now, how many of those predictions were there? Well, there's many scholars that have gone and looked at the Bible and said, well, is this a prediction about the coming Messiah? Is this a prediction that just refer to Jesus? And you know, some of them actually were identified by Jesus himself and as references, and maybe in the past they weren't considered that way. And certainly in the Jewish traditions they were looking for the Messiah, but some of the predictions they didn't think applied to Messiah because it wasn't the sort of Messiah they were looking for. But we've had many famous scholars go through the Bible and say, how many predictions were there of Jesus? And one of those was an Oxford University scholar, very highly educated, acclaimed, thorough researcher, very honest and thorough research. His name was H.P. Liddon. And he came up with a definitive answer, 332 distinct prophecies, distinct predictions in the Old Testament about the coming Messiah, and he believed they were fulfilled in Jesus. Now, what does that mean? So 332 distinct predictions about Christ. Did Jesus fulfill all of those? Because if he didn't fulfill one of those, then we would have a problem, wouldn't we? And what does that mean if he did fulfill all those? Well, somebody was trying to work out what is the chance of one person fulfilling all of these prophecies. And this guy called Professor Peter Stoner, who was a professor of mathematics in a prestigious university in America, and is also the head of the Mathematics Society, and he was a very capable, very highly acclaimed mathematician. He decided to work out the probability of one person fulfilling all of these prophecies. Now, I don't know whether you've played with probability. Maybe some of you actually use probabilities and predictions in the context of your education or in the context of your job. Actually, we probably all deal with probabilities to some degree and not even knowing it, but some people specifically deal with probabilities. And there's two ways in which, there's simple probabilities, like what's called linear probability. I actually had to get all this around. I was doing a master's degree in clinical psychology, and I did a research project, and I had to get my head around multiple variate analysis, or multivariate analysis. I'll talk about it in a minute. But let's start off with, just to give you an understanding of how probabilities work, let's start off with linear probability, which is a simple method of determining an outcome. So let's say I pick up a coin and I flip the coin. What's the chance of me getting a head? Heads. What's the chance? 50-50, 1 in 2, right? Flip the coin. If I flip it again, what's the chance of me getting a head again? Heads again. 1 in 4. If I flip it again, the third time, 1 in 8. Flip it again, 1 in 16 of me getting heads again. That's probability, right? What's the chances of the more variables you put in there, the more unlikely you are to get heads. That's the probability. Now, I think winning Tats Lotto, it's 1 in 20 million. I can't remember. It's unlikely that you're going to win Tats Lotto because of the probabilities. 1 in 20 million, or the probability of something happening in this world is, this. I don't know what the probability of you getting coronavirus is because nobody can seem to work that one out. But let's go a bit deeper than that, and this is what Stoner was really good at. Actually, Stoner was one of the pioneers in this field of multivariate analysis because he was doing this mathematical computations before they had the assistance of highly complex computing. The multivariate analysis takes all of these variables, all of these things that could happen, and rotates it on a matrix and looks at what the probability is of this particular outcome happening. And that's what I was doing in my research project, was using multivariate analysis. And you can have orthogonal rotations and oblique rotations. Now, I'm not going to go into all of that. It's really interesting, though. Some of you might know what I'm talking about. But the more variables you get, it's not just a linear probability, because there's all of these other possibilities, and you've got to look at all these variables, and then you rotate it on a matrix and you work out which ones link to each other, and you can actually work out the probability of something happening in a social setting. So I was doing research, and I was looking at the correlation between stress management and spiritual maturity, which means I had to go out and do a spiritual maturity test, and I had to go out and do a stress, and got all these results, and then I had to factor in all of the personal factors associated with this group I was looking at. That all been, then you'd rotate. You know what? It took a computer all night to calculate out my basic results, chopping through all this stuff, so that I would work out what's the probability of this outcome. And what I'd established was, the more spiritual maturity you have, the greater your ability to cope with stress. And they were so excited, my supervisors, about the outcome. They wanted me to do a PhD, and I was not excited about that at all. So I didn't. So this is what we're talking about. So what is the probability of Jesus fulfilling these predictions? Because all we have to do is get one wrong, then it's a problem. But let's say, what's the probability? Well, Stoner tried to answer that question, and others have since done this. And he took 8 prophecies, and these prophecies were, this is just 8 of the 300 plus prophecies. Born at Bethlehem. Now Jesus, so some people who have criticised this work have said, well, Jesus just went out, worked out what the prophecies were and fulfilled them, because they can't accept that Jesus. But it's pretty hard for Jesus to determine where he was born. That was a bit of a problem in saying that Jesus manipulated that. He didn't, did he? He couldn't. So these are the 8 prophecies that he took. Born at Bethlehem, that's in Micah 5:2, Matthew 2:1. Jesus' parents lived in Nazareth, and yet Jesus was born in Bethlehem. The prediction in the Old Testament was that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. Preceded by a messenger, Isaiah 43, Malachi 3:1, and that's fulfilled in Matthew 3:1 and 2. Entered Jerusalem on a donkey. Well, yeah, he could have gone and looked at the prophecies and said, I'm going to go and get a donkey, unridden colt. But if you read how that happened, it's quite unique. Betrayed by a friend. He didn't go to Judas and say, Judas, you're my friend, go betray me. Didn't do that, did he? Betrayed by a friend, Psalm 41:9, Psalm 55:12-14, Matthew 10:4 is where that's fulfilled. Sold for 30 pieces of silver, Zechariah 11:12. Money to be thrown in God's house and used to buy a potter's field. That's pretty specific. Zechariah 11:13b, that's fulfilled in Matthew 27:5 and 7. Silent before his accusers. Well, yeah, he could have chosen to do that one. That's Isaiah 53:7. Crucified. How he died, actually. Description of his crucifixion. Psalm 22:16, Isaiah 53:5-12. That's fulfilled in Luke 23:33 and Matthew 27:38. Let's just say that's 8 of the 300 plus. Now, what's the probability of one man fulfilling these prophecies? This is what Stoner worked on. And he worked out the probability of somebody fulfilling one person. Those 8, just those 8, was 1 10 to the 17. Okay? So that's 10. I actually put it up there with 17 zeros after that. You know, if you went into a Tatslotto and that was your odds, you probably wouldn't buy a ticket. 1 in 10 to the 17. Now, what does that mean? Well, let me try and describe what that means with regards to one person having a chance of fulfilling those things. Let's say you take a coin, 20-cent coin, and then you get a whole pile of those coins. We'll talk about how many. But let's say you get a unique 20-cent coin, and it's what's called, if you put up the next slide, I think it shows that one. Okay. Now, when the 20-cent coins were first minted in 1966, some smarty pants decided, oh, and by the way, the English didn't think we could mint our coins, so they all decided they were going to actually, the mint, they were going to do them in England, and they sent these dies over to stamp the coins. Somebody made one of the dies with a different bottom on the 20 cents. It was called wavy base. They started churning out these coins, and they did a check of them, and they found that one of them was not like the others. And so they stopped printing them, pressing them, and they took that die out and they put another one in. So there's very, very few. 58,000.2 million 20-cent coins were struck in 1966, and only a few of them were wavy-base 20-cent coins. If you actually dig in your wallet and you find one of those wavy-base coins, you better hang on to it, because a good one of those is worth $5,000. So we take a unique coin, right? A unique Jesus, unique coin. Now let's say we get 20-cent pieces, 10 to the 17 20-cent pieces would cover the state of Western Australia to a depth of 1 metre. So you think of the area of the state of Western Australia, you get 10 to the 17 20-cent pieces, you cover the state of Western Australia, and then you get one wavy base coin and you throw it in the middle and you stir it all up and you blindfold somebody, you put a blindfold on them and you tell them walk all over Western Australia and pick up one coin. That's the chance of this prophecy being fulfilled in one person. That's the extent of 8 prophecies. Well, let's go a bit further than that. Let's say we take 48 prophecies. Now, people say, well, some of these prophecies are a bit vague. This is another criticism of Stoner's work and some other mathematicians, astrophysicists who've come after that. They say, well, how can that really refer to Jesus? We won't argue that. So Stoner took the 48, which are absolutely obvious, not the 300. And he thought, oh, I'll work on those. Well, the odds go up to 1 in 10 to 150 to the power of 157. So I couldn't even put those up there. It's 157 zeros after the 10. Now these odds are that's way too big for me to even describe what that looks like. But let's take 10 to the 28. Okay, not 10 to the 157, 10 to the 28, because it's really where you stop making any sense at all. Now let's say we take 10 to the 28 20-cent pieces. There we go. I haven't put them all up there because I'll tell you why I haven't. Let's say we get all these 20-cent pieces and we make a mass the size of the sun. Okay? We're still not there yet, 10 to the 28. There are 10 billion trillion stars in the universe, in the cosmos. 10 billion trillion stars in the galaxy. We still don't have enough stars to make this 10 to the 28. It's not enough. But let's say we got that many 20-cent pieces together and we had them all in the universe in the 10 billion trillion stars, and then we got one wavy-based 20-cent piece, and then we went and threw it out into the universe and we stirred it all up, and then we got a blindfolded man, put him in a spaceship and go, you can go all over the universe and pick up one. That's the probability of one person fulfilling 10 to the 28, not 10 to the 157, not... Can you see? The fact that Jesus fulfilled all of those predictions, at least 300 or 400 years, the last one before he was born, but over a 1,000-year period, it is beyond the realms of possibility. There's something different about Jesus. Let's look at other religions then. So, how is Jesus different than other religions? Now, I actually, in researching this, I decided I'd find out how many other religions there were in the world that were started by a person. Like a founder had a founder of a religion. Now, it could be argued that Christianity isn't a religion. It's a relationship with Jesus, and it's a movement, but let's say it's classified as a religion. And I found 178 founders of religions that are world religions, that are recognised in the world. 178 founders. So take those 178 founders and say, how was Jesus unique? How was he different? Well, out of all those 178 founders, and I looked at quite a few of the major ones, none of them were predicted. None. To be coming to start a religion, to do something beyond the physical. None of them predicted. Only Jesus was predicted. Only Jesus. In fact, most of them didn't emerge until they were after they were 20 years old, but most of them after 30-year-old. They had an insignificant life up until that. So Jesus is remarkable when compared to all the other founders of religions. But then Jesus' birth was remarkable, and none of these other founders had a remarkable birth either. None of them, because they weren't even identified as founders of religion until their adult life. So how was Jesus' birth remarkable? In Isaiah 7:14 we read, the Lord himself will give you a sign, a virgin will conceive a child, she will give birth to a son, and we'll call him Emmanuel. This means God is with us. This was written 800 years before Jesus came. When Jesus was born of a virgin, although that could be argued, when Jesus was born of a virgin, the shepherds were out in the field and all these angels turned up and told them about Jesus. Now that's pretty unique. In Luke 2:25 to 35, 8 days after the birth of Jesus, his mother brought him to the temple, and Simeon, a prophet, somebody who was a highly respected religious leader, was in the temple and had been waiting all his life for the Messiah to turn up and recognise Jesus. So this is his baby. At his birth, he's recognised. Right at his birth, Jesus is recognised as being unique. This has never happened in the history of humanity in any other religious context. And in Luke 2:36 to 38, Anna, a prophet, was also there in the temple awaiting the Messiah, and she identified Jesus as the Messiah as well, without reference to Simeon. And then when Jesus was born, not straight after his birth, we think this was a little bit of time after his birth, these three very wealthy people turned up from other parts of the world, usually called the three wise kings, but they weren't even kings. They were actually they were magi, and they were looking in the world for this unique person because they realised through their studies and through their investigations that something was going to happen and one unique person was going to come to this world. And they went and they came. They turned up and they said, this is it. This is Jesus. This is him. He had an absolutely unique birth. This has made him unique in the context of all other religious leaders. Then Jesus had a unique childhood as well. He was very special as he was growing up. At the age of 12, his parents took him to Jerusalem. It's when they were declared from being a child to an adult. And so they were in Jerusalem, and let's read about that story. Luke chapter 2, verse 41 to 52. Every year Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the Passover festival. When Jesus was 12 years old, they attended the festival as usual. After the celebration was over, they started home to Nazareth. But Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents didn't miss him at first because they assumed he was among the other travellers, but when he didn't show up that evening, they started looking for him among their relatives and friends. So, how come they didn't know that Jesus was with them? They travelled in these great big groups. Now, what happened was that the women and the children travelled at the back of the group, and the men travelled at the front of the group, and the adult children. Now, Jesus was just turning an adult. He's 12 years old. So I would have presumed that Joseph was up the front and Mary was down the back, and Mary thought Jesus was up the front and Joseph thought Jesus was down the back, and they were travelling on because people say, well, how on earth didn't they know? And they got all this way, and then the evening came for them to have a meal and Jesus didn't turn up. Well, they'd be pretty distraught. Now, we have a son, Michael, and he was an interesting child when we were growing up, and he's like hiding. You know, we'd go into a shopping centre and he'd hide. We went into Kmart and he'd hide. You know those racks of clothing in a circle? He'd hide in the middle of those, stand like this, and you walk past him, Michael! He wouldn't even tell you. So you're going, oh no, what are we going to do? You know, and you'd be walking off, Jenny and I'd be walking off, we'd be walking off and we're going over to get a meal and where's Michael? Right? One time, you know that you got these little cabinets with clothes stacked on top and they've got drawers under them, cupboards. He hid in one of those cupboards. And we had the whole of the Kmart staff looking for him. And eventually he popped his head out and said, hi. Well, we know how distraught you are when you lose a child. You can imagine how distraught Mary and Joseph. They rushed back and they're really distraught. Let's say when they couldn't find him, they went back to Jerusalem to search for him there. 3 days later, 3 days. It used to take us 3 hours to find Michael, but 3 days. 3 days later, they finally discovered him in the temple, sitting amongst the religious leaders who were the greatest academics of the time, sitting amongst the religious leaders, 12-year-old boy, listening to them and asking them questions. All who heard him were amazed at his understanding his answers. His parents didn't know what to think. Son, his mother said to him, why have you done this to us? We used to say that to Michael all the time. Why are you doing it? What were you thinking? Don't you realise that? Your father and I have been frantic. Oh boy, I can identify with this. Searching for you everywhere. And what does Jesus say? Oh, but why did you need to search? Didn't you know that I must be about my Father's house? And they didn't understand what he meant. So Jesus is there for 4 days, sitting with the greatest academics of the time, astounding them and questioning them with questions they couldn't answer and answering questions they couldn't answer. That's pretty unique. That's pretty unique. He returned to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them, and his mother stored all these things in her heart. Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favour with God and all the people. So what would Jesus be like? You know, let's have a think about that. If he's human and divine, what would he be like? Because we're told in the Bible that Jesus was fully human, just like us, and yet he was fully divine. But what does it mean to be fully human? Well, I've looked at that and I've thought about that. You know, what would it be? Because, you know, when Adam and Eve decided they were going to choose corruption instead of the ideal, what was the outcome of all that? You know, how did that affect humanity? Well, I think we're a shadow of what we could be. We have to live with the consequences of choices not to go God's way. But what does it mean to be fully human? Well, what would it be like if you were perfect and you weren't affected by sin and corruption and all the other stuff? Well, I think you get a taste of it a little bit. Have you ever met anybody with a photographic memory? I have. They find it very easy to study. I mean, if you watch the Chase on Channel 7, some of those people, I think, have got a photographic memory. They ask a question of somebody and about, who was born at this particular time, and then they go, well, I don't know, get it wrong. And then the chaser says, well, they were born at this time, here and there. I mean, they just know it. I mean, it's just this photographic memory, right? And who knows what the capacity of being fully human is? We get a taste of that. We came across it. We lived in Colorado for 10 years, when I was the leader of an international organisation. And there was this guy over there called Derek Amato. And his picture's going to come up now. That's him. He dived into a swimming pool and hit his head. Now, in most cases, that usually causes you to get paralysed or, serious injury. He dived in the swimming pool, hit his head, and recovered. And one day he was at his friend's house and his friend had a piano. And he went up to the piano and he started playing this amazingly complex piece of music. And his friend said to him, I didn't know you knew how to play the piano. He says, I don't. It's the first time we've ever sat at a piano. And he played this amazingly. Well, then they thought, well, let's try him out on some other instruments. And they tried him on a guitar and they tried him on this and they tried him out. 8 instruments he could play that he'd never learned. I've asked Jenny to hit me on the head a couple of times. It hasn't worked. I play guitar, but that's it. She plays keyboards. Brilliant. But I can't do it. And so this guy became famous. This is him on the Today Show in America. He became famous. He has his own concerts. He's released all these albums, and he never learned music. And they asked him on these shows, how do you do this? He said, I just see it. I just see it, and my hands play the music. This is what the capacity, I think, of a human brain. The average brain can hold as much information in its memory banks that are contained in the entire internet in the world. And that's 2.5 petabytes, which is 2.5 million gigabytes. That's how much a brain has the capacity to hold information. Now, if you could access all that, wow. I mean, there's people you can go and ask, and I know you might have encountered some, you can ask them, you give them a date, any date, in their lifetime, and they can remember exactly what they did, what the weather was like, what the temperature was like, what event happened on that date. It's absolutely phenomenal. I can't remember what they do, the word they use to describe that. The average brain cell is inactive 80% of the time and uses around 20 watts of energy. They've tried to recreate brains by using computers. The problem they have is that it requires 50 million times more energy for a computer to do the same task as a human brain. And they just don't have enough energy in the world to make that happen at the moment. So, what would Jesus be like if he had the full capacity of his brain? Fully human. I mean, this is a bit speculation, but there's evidence that Jesus had the full capacity from a human perspective. He was quite unique in that regard. So how would you like to grow up with somebody who like that? Imagine his brothers and sisters, and he had brothers and sisters. What would you feel if he got everything right and he did everything right? How would your brothers and sisters react to that? It must have been really hard for them to grow up with somebody who did everything right and did everything well and knew everything. Wow. Well, his family didn't react well to him. In Mark 3, verse 20 to 21, one time Jesus entered a house and the crowds began to gather around, and soon he and his disciples couldn't find time to eat. When his family heard what was happening, they tried to take him away, saying he is absolutely out of his mind. And there are a number of occasions when his family turned up and they said, Jesus, you're lost the plot here. He didn't have the full support of his family because he was unique. Usually unique people get isolated and get misunderstood. Again, this is evidence that Jesus was unique. How would his peer group cope? How would you like to go to school with somebody who got everything right? Who would the teacher be asking? Well, now Jesus, would you please explain this to everybody else? It's not. Would have been interesting. But Jesus was also fully divine. He was God. He created the world. He was the visible image of an invisible God. Now, what is the thing that we should be appealing to that would indicate that Jesus was divine? Well, Jesus said, when he was asked, well, you claim to be God, Jesus. The Pharisees, religious leaders, knew what Jesus was claiming. You're claiming to be God? Okay, prove it. And what did Jesus say? He said, you kill me, 3 days later I'll come back alive again. Now, they didn't understand what he was saying because it didn't even factor into their world. But he told his disciples that all the time. I'm going to prove to you that I'm God, or I'm going to actually, you'll know when I come back to life. And they didn't want Jesus to die. And he kept telling them. I mean, you could read it. It's plain. Actually, he was much more upfront with his disciples. Let's read 1 Corinthians 15, verse 1 to 8, where Paul says, let me now remind you, dear brothers and sisters, of the good news I preached to you before. You welcomed it then, and you still stand firm in it. This is the good news that saves you if you continue to believe in the message I told you, unless, of course, you believe something that was never true in the first place. I passed on to you what was most important and what had also been passed on to me. Christ died for our sins, just as the Scriptures said, just as it was predicted. He was buried and he was raised from the dead on the third day, just as the Scriptures said. Again, these are prophecies, the predictions that Jesus fulfilled. He was seen by Peter and then by the 12, and after that he was seen by more than 500 of his followers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. There's 500 people at this time it's written who could attest to Jesus' resurrection, who saw Jesus after his death. That's a pretty good evidential group of people who you can go to and say, this happened. This happened. And then he was seen by James and later all the prophets. And last of all, as though I have been born at the wrong time, I have also seen him, and it radically changed Paul's life. Because Paul was going out trying to destroy the church, kill all the people who claimed to follow Jesus, and then he met Jesus. And that sort of changed his world. And then he took on the responsibility of sharing Jesus. Jesus was predicted in Scripture, but Jesus passed the ultimate test of uniqueness and his claims. In Colossians 1, 15 and 19 we read, he existed before everything else was created. He existed before anything else was created and is supreme over all creation. So it's saying here that Jesus already existed before he was born. He existed before anything else was created and supreme over all creation. For through him, God created everything in heaven and on earth. He made the things we can see and the things we can't see, such as thrones, kingdoms, rulers, authorities in the unseen world. Everything was created through him and for him. So Jesus was the creator of the world. He existed before anything else, and he holds all creation together. Christ is also the head of the church, which is his body. He is the beginning, supreme over all who rise from the dead. Again, he can say, I have power over death. What other religious leader says that? He is the beginning, supreme over all rise from the dead. And so he is first in everything. For God, this is it, for God in all his fullness was pleased to live in Christ. And through him, God reconciled everything to himself. So, to finish up, what's the historical significance? If you actually dismiss all that, what's the historical significance of Jesus? Well, first of all, we've got this calendar, the Gregorian calendar. Now, there are different calendars from different cultures in the world, but the Gregorian calendar is the one that's been adopted globally as the universal calendar for the world. And it used to be BC AD, before Christ's birth, and AD Annus Domini, which is a medieval Latin term which means in the year of the Lord, after Jesus' birth. But these people didn't like Jesus being the reference point for their calendar. So what do they do now? You go to school now, you're in university, you're studying history, what will you find? The books have been changed, BCE and CE. before the Common Era, and in the Common Era. We're called the Common Era, and they actually tried to delete Jesus out of the calendar, out of our universal calendar. Now, you go and ask an historian, what does BCE mean? What's the reference point for BCE and CE? Well, they've got to admit, well, it was the birth of Jesus. They haven't changed it. And the event that determines their BCE and the Common Era is Jesus. It's pivotal. You go all over the world, you turn up in any country and they're celebrating Christmas. Anywhere in the world. In Islamic countries. I've been in Islamic countries and they're celebrating Christmas. Got Christmas in all of the stores. Well, why do we have Christmas? Jesus. More books have been written about Jesus than any other person in history. Nations have used Jesus' words and teachings as the foundation of their constitutions. Every democratic nation in the world has used the Bible as the foundation of their constitution. And their laws and the way they do government. Jesus' Sermon on the Mount established a new paradigm for ethics and morals. Do for others as you have them do for you was just one example of that. Schools, orphanages, hospitals, humanitarian works have been founded in the name of Jesus. Over 100 of the greatest universities in the world today, including Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Dartmouth, Columbia, and Oxford, were all begun by Jesus' followers for the purpose of following the teachings of Jesus. Jesus elevated the role of women in Western culture because women in Jesus' days were considered inferior and virtually non-persons. But if you read the stories of Jesus, he's got all these women around him, he validated women. And that changed how we treat women in Western culture. Slavery was abolished in Britain and America due to Jesus' teachings that each human life is of equal value. And 2.2 billion people identify as Christians in the world. So, you can dismiss Jesus, and a lot of people do, but you can't ignore him. Let's pray.